I'm a bit embarrassed to present my talk after so many and so excellent speakers, but I'll do my best. In my talk, I would like to present an interpretation of some interesting aspects of Hurtado's teaching on matter and form, comparing it, as time allows, with those of Arriaga and occasionally Suarez, and suggesting some wider contexts. In my investigation, I will be led by the following question. To which extent, if at all, can Hurtado be said to prepare or approach Cartesian dualism, a charge that is sometimes raised against Arriaga? Naturally, I will base my exposition primarily on his treatise on matter and form as the principles of the corporeal substance, which forms the initial part of his tome on corporeal substance, this physics, the Tomus Secundus of his Universa Philosophia. I'm using the 1624 edition. However, there are also several important doctrinal loci in other parts of his course that need to be taken into account. As regards the various scholastic interpretations of halomorphism, the main battle lines are often drawn between the Thomists on the one hand and the rest of the world on the other. As the common source of most of the differences can be identified, the notorious disagreement over the nature of prime matter, and by implication, over the nature and purpose of halomorphic analysis as such. It's not just that the Thomists insist on prime matter being an absolutely pure potentiality with no trace of any act whatsoever, while the rest of the scholastic thinkers are not so radical. That is, that all but the Thomists ascribe at least an entitative act to prime matter. The difference is not merely one of degree. By refusing to ascribe entitative act to prime matter, the Thomists refuse to treat it as a being, and by implication, they interpret halomorphic analysis as sub-entitative, so to speak. That is, explaining the constitution of a corporeal being by means of items that themselves do not reach the level of beings. The very beingness of a corporeal being can thus be reductively explained away, the Thomists believe, that is, reduced to something more basic than being, namely the principles of being, matter, and form. In the non-Thomistic approach, however, the ascription of an entitative act to prime matter stems from an entirely different understanding of the nature and purpose of halomorphic analysis. The basic motivation behind this doctrine is the perceived absurdity of ascribing any explanatory or causal role to a non-entity, an item having no being whatsoever. For the non-Thomists, it would be absurd to try to explain the constitution of a material being by recourse to items that are not beings. Instead, they treat the halomorphic theory as providing an analysis of complex beings in terms of simple beings. And so their approach consciously restrains itself to the realm of beings. They earn from the Thomists the accusation of reifying the principles for that, whereas they themselves accuse their opponents of being absurd in claiming that there is something, namely the prime matter, that is neither nothing nor actual a something, or that it is possible to differ from nothingness, but not in virtue of an act. Hurtado, as might be expected, aligns himself with the anti-Thomists from the start. He defines prime matter as the common substantial subject of substantial change, incapable of corruption, from which all physical bodies of the category of substance come to be. Quotation 1. No Thomist would ever call pure potency a subject without qualification, let alone a substantial subject. But since for Hurtado matter is a being, and not an accidental one, it cannot be but a substantial one. Furthermore, Hurtado subscribes to the common anti-Thomistic claim that matter does not exist by the existence of form, but is endowed with its own existence. Hurtado notes that the question of denying matter its own existence only arises on the Thomistic assumption that existence is really distinct from essence. But although he does not endorse this Thomistic assumption, he wants to prove his thesis independently of its negation. And given his principles, it is indeed hard to see how one could escape his conclusion. For once, we have assumed that prime matter is being, that is, something capable of existing at all, it's very difficult to devise a plausible scenario how it could exist by existence proper to something else. For one thing, there is one indivisible action that produces the prime matter both according to its essence and its existence, namely creation by God. Whereas a material form is produced through generation by a secondary cause. Therefore, the existence of matter cannot be that self-same existence of the form. And it's futile to suggest that there might be two different actions, one terminated at the essence of matter and the other at its existence, borrowed from the form. For what is the job of the first essence-only terminated action supposed to be, asked Hurtado? The production of the essence of the matter, obviously. But to produce means to bestow actuality, to posit an item outside the causes into reality. In other words, to bestow existence. So, assuming that the essence of matter can be produced at all, and that it can be produced independently of any particular substantial form, it follows that the existence it inevitably receives by such a production is its own, inseparable from it. Now it's important to be aware that the Thomists do not, in fact, say that the matter exists through the existence of the form. In their view, matter and form, apart from the human soul, are just not items capable of existing or not existing. They are not the items that exist, but the items through which the composite substance exists. They can be said to exist only in an improper sense, in which to exist means to compose something that exists. The existence that is brought by the form does not belong to that form and is not actually bestowed on the matter. But while originating from the form, it belongs to and is bestowed on the composite. No sooner than on the level of the composite do we arrive at something that is, at an entity, something that can be produced or perish, etc. But Hurtado argues further. The idea that prime matter is something else than an actual existing entity is untenable. For we assume that the matter does the job of a material cause, and a cause can only perform real causality under the condition that it exists, that it is really there. Quotation 7 on your handouts. Hurtado even briefly applies the same principle to the Thomistic doctrine of the real distinction between essence and existence, showing how it leads to an absurdity. For just like matter must be something real that is existing in order to be capable of providing its material causality to the form, so also the subject of the supposedly really distinct actus essendi, whatever that might be, would have to be something real and therefore existing in order to be able to provide the material causality in which the reception and sustentation of that actus essendi consists. In other words, the essence, if distinct from existence, would have to exist in the first place in order to be able to receive existence. Quotation 2 in your handouts. How far removed from Thomism Hurtado is can be glimpsed also from the fact that while defending himself against certain Thomistic objections, he bites the bullet and boldly concedes that prime matter not only is not pure potentiality, but it is an incomplete subsistent act. Anything that is extra nihil, that means not a mere objective potency, must be an act. Acts, however, come in kinds. Some are informing, that is, their ask is to inform and so actualize a subject, and some are subsistent, that is, standalone, not inhering in anything, but subsisting in themselves. These are further subdivided into complete and incomplete acts. Examples of the former being the simple immaterial substances like angels, while the latter kind is represented by rational soul or prime matter. Here we can note that Hurtado believes that although de facto the matter of the entire sublunar world and probably also the supralunar spheres is one and the same species, de potentia absoluta, God could create a specifically different matter of corruptible things. According to Hurtado, then, matter is an act, a being, a substance, and a body and even a specifically determined body. However, it's not a complete body, a complete corporeal substance, for it is a body which is, naturally, a mere essential part of a complete substance, together with substantial form, by which it is informed and perfected. The incompleteness of matter qua a substance seems to mean just that, its capacity to be further perfected substantially, that is, not merely accidentally. How do we know that prime matter exists at all? The standard reply among the scholastics is to invoke the assumedly obvious reality of substantial change and the need for a common subject. Hurtado does the same, but he asks further. How can we be sure there actually is such a persisting subject? Interestingly, he doesn't offer any a priori reason, but he makes a recourse to experience. He says, quotation 4, "We can see with our own eyes that when a man dies, many of his accidents remain which cannot exist without the substantial subject. And since they cannot inhere in the soul, which has departed from the body, nor in any completely new subject, there must be a common subject for them to inhere in." This brings us to another Hurtado's anti-Thomistic doctrine, namely that some accidents, and quantity in the first place, can inhere not in the composite substance, but directly in the prime matter, thus being able to survive the corruption of the substance in question. This position can boast with quite a strong support in the tradition of Aristotelian commentatorship. It was maintained by Ammonius, Philoponus, Simplicius, and later, most importantly, by Averroes, the commentator par excellence, who transmitted it to his many Latin followers. It is, however, for many reasons, clearly incompatible with the Thomistic interpretation of hylomorphism, in which substantial form is defined as the first form inhering in matter, and providing thus the resulting composite with esse simpliciter. It would be a contradiction in terms in Thomism to say that an accidental form inheres immediately in matter alone. Furthermore, accidents need a substance to inhere in, but the Thomistic prime matter is not a substance, for it's not even an entity. Surprisingly enough, however, Aquinas himself is not always crystal clear about this point. For example, when talking about the dispositions in matter for a certain substantial form, or when saying that quantitas se tenet ex parte materiae et qualitas ex parte formae. And later Thomists sometimes have a hard time to extricate him from the suspicion that he might have stated this doctrine. On the other hand, on the non-Thomistic interpretation of hylomorphism, there seems to be no prima facie reason why some accidents, and especially quantity, could not inhere in the matter independently from a substantial form. And this position seems inevitable, at least with regard to human person. For in man, the substantial form is the rational soul, which is unextended and therefore incapable of receiving the formal effects of quantity. And since in the non-Thomistic view, matter and form are not merely intrinsic principles of the composite, but partial substances, it's impossible that a form should inhere in the composite without inhering in either or both its constitutive parts. So, given that quantity cannot inhere in the rational soul, it must inhere in the matter alone. And if that is possible, or even necessary in man, why not elsewhere? Asks Hurtado. This is basically the argumentation of Suarez, who subscribes to a sophisticated version of the Averroistic position presented as a synthesis of the insights by both parties. Suarez concedes to the Thomists that quantity is always received in the whole composite, in the sense that the whole composite is its subjectum denominationis, that is, that which receives the denomination bestowed by the form. A man as a whole, not just his body, is called extended. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that quantity physically inheres in both the matter and the form. We call the whole man intellectual in spite of the fact that his intellect only inheres in his soul. So, in a similar way, the fact that the whole man is called extended does not preclude his quantity to physically inhere solely in his matter. According to Suarez, then, quantity imparts its denomination to the whole composite by inhering in the matter alone, as in its subjectum inhesionis, or as Suarez alternatively puts it, what receives the quantity is the composite, but the ratio recipiendi, that is, that through which the quantity is received by the composite, is matter alone. Now, Hurtado adopts the gist of Suarez's argumentation, but radicalizes his conclusions. While Suarez only claimed with certainty that in some cases, namely the case of man, quantity is received in matter alone, Hurtado insists that it is always so. According to him, even a purely material and so extended substantial form is extended not in virtue of an accident of quantity supposedly inhering in the form, but rather in virtue of the extension of the matter in which the form itself inheres. For Hurtado, unlike Arriaga, nothing but matter can be subject of quantity. Only material things can be extended. So even a purely material extended form, like that of water, for example, presupposes an already extended matter, and so quantity must inhere in that matter antecedently to the substantial form. Moreover, Hurtado does not mention Suarez's distinction between the subject of denomination and the subject of inhesion, and merely concedes in passing that the whole composite can also be called extended in virtue of the extension of matter alone. And finally, Hurtado also drops another Suarez's pro-Thomist thesis, namely his sophisticated and a bit contrived doctrine that quantity, despite inhering immediately in matter and being prior to substantial form according to duration, is still posterior to substantial form and its union with the matter according to nature. As we have seen, Hurtado ascribes to matter material causality, and this notion even plays a crucial role in his anti-Thomistic argumentation. However, it is not easy to find out what exactly Hurtado means by that notion. In the scholastic thought, there are two main paradigms how to approach material causality, which are often somewhat confused or merged in various authors. The first paradigm conceives of material cause as one of the four different causes of the hylomorphic compound. The composite is regarded as the effect, which is simultaneously caused in four different ways, ordered among themselves by the four different Aristotelian causes. The form, in this view, is regarded not as an effect of the matter, but as its co-cause. In its pure and highly elaborate form, this approach can be found in Scotus's Tractatus de Primo Principio, chapter 1 and 2, and nowhere else, as far as I know. The second paradigm construes material causality not primarily in relation to the composite, but to the form. Matter is conceived as imparting some effects, like sustentation, limitation, or individuation, to the form that inheres in it. Notice, however, that in this way it's difficult to explain why matter is called an intrinsic cause, as it clearly is not intrinsic to the form, which is considered its effect. While the causality of the matter toward the form is implicitly or explicitly endorsed by almost any scholastic, I know but of one case of explicitly rejecting the causality of the matter toward the composite. And this is Arriaga, who says that, quotation 5, there seems to be nothing that needs to be said about the effect of the material cause, since it is the form itself sustained by the matter, whereas the entire composite is not the effect of the material cause, properly and rigorously speaking, because the composite is not produced by, but composed of the parts. However, Arriaga's understanding of material causality is quite idiosyncratic, to put it mildly. He seems to construe it as a kind of production of the respective form, very similar to efficient causality, but much less perfect. And in fact, he does not really believe in its existence. Indeed, it's hard to see the need for just another production on the part of matter, allegedly needed to complement the production performed by the efficient cause. Also, one can agree with Arriaga that it seems weird to ascribe to such an imperfect entity as prime matter the virtual capacity of literally producing any material form whatsoever. But of course, all this is very far removed from the standard Aristotelian conception of material cause. Now, where does Hurtado stand as regards material causality? The answer is, it's not easy to tell. Hurtado's treatise on causes contains only disputation on causes in general, disputation 8, on the created efficient cause, disputation 9, and on the first cause, disputation 10. On the other hand, Hurtado needs the notion of material cause, and in disputation 8 on causes in general, he lists all the 4 Aristotelian causes, although his nomenclature is a bit idiosyncratic. And as far as one can tell from this brief passage, his only real deviation from standard Aristotelianism is that he only ascribes real influence to material, formal, and efficient cause, and groups final cause together with moral cause under those having a mere metaphorical influence. That's what we have heard. So we learn that material cause is real, according to him, but that's about all. In a bunch of other places, Hurtado adds some further remarks on material causality. When talking about motion, he says that material causality is intrinsic both to the cause and to the effect, out of whose intrinsic communion a unity results. Quotation 6. Since a composite unity results from the union of matter and form, it seems here that Hurtado regards the form and not the composite as the effect of the material cause. This is in agreement with his argument mentioned before, that matter is a true material cause and therefore must of itself exist. For Hurtado says explicitly that at that place, that matter is a true cause of a material form. Again, quotation 7. Hurtado also says that material cause is receptive of motion and for that reason must intrinsically communicate itself to its effect, but also be really distinct from it, quotation 8. And finally, he says that the material cause is a passive cause that receives passively the perfection or imperfection of its effect. In sum, it seems that Hurtado, unlike, for example, Suarez, clearly adheres to the non-Scotistic approach to formal causality, to material causality, despite the talk of intrinsic communication of the material cause to the effect. The effect here is not the whole composite, but the form alone. Otherwise, his understanding of material causation doesn't seem to be very far removed from the traditional views, and it definitely does not resemble nor foreshadow that of Arriaga. What about formal causality? There seems to be just one place where Hurtado says ex cathedra something important about it, namely the first disputation on generation and corruption. He offers nothing less than a definition here. A formal cause is a positive form from which, without the production of any effect, a denomination results. Now, denomination is an important notion for Hurtado. In the scholastic terminology, denomination is not merely a matter of linguistics or semantics. It is not just a derived name. Rather, it's a metaphysical reality. It is, as it were, a metaphysical claim to a predicate, whether it's actually honored by the linguistic community or not. Denominations come in 2 kinds. They are either intrinsic or extrinsic. Typically, an intrinsic denomination is derived from a form that inheres within the denominated thing. For example, the denomination white. An extrinsic denomination is derived from something that is located without the denominated thing. For example, the denomination talked about. What is interesting in Hurtado is that he uses the notion of denomination to define a formal cause. A formal cause is a form that imparts a denomination to a thing without any production being involved. However, a formal cause has a real influence on its effect. This distinguishes it from a mere formal ratio, ratio formalis, which can also be negative, a privation. This seems to be an original and yet profound attempt to capture the Aristotelian notion of formal cause. But the notion of denomination is of much greater importance to Hurtado. He has established that matter as an incomplete corporeal substance and even an incomplete subsistent act. So one might wonder, In what sense can we also say that matter is a potency? Why matter is a potency and the form an act? An easy Aristotelian answer in terms of forms being adduced from the potentiality of the matter is unfortunately precluded here by the Catholic dogma that rational soul is a substantial form defined as first act of a potentially living organic body, and yet it's not adduced from the potentiality of the matter, but created by God. Hurtado's response, later to be contested by Arriaga, boils down to the notion of denomination. When two things are united, the title of form, an act, is ascribed to the one which imparts a denomination and a formal effect to the other. This latter being called a subject or material cause or passive potency, quotation 11. And even in the case of man, Hurtado argues fervently against certain non-nulli who fancied that in relation to the body, the rational soul is a merely assisting but not informing act. Hurtado rejects this position as opposed both to faith and natural reason. As for the latter, it would destroy the unity of man, since the merely assisting rational soul would have to be distinct from the sensitive soul, which clearly is informing the body. But in that case, this sensitive composite would be a complete substance, and so there would be no greater unity between the rational soul and the sensitive body than between a captain and his ship. Regarding the material forms, furthermore, Hurtado very traditionally asserts that they are truly and properly generated and adduced from the potentiality of matter. Now, Hurtado has a rich teaching on the union of matter and form, which I will skip because we heard about it already. And so I will draw to a sort of conclusion. Can we say that Hurtado's position is drawing near to the line dividing hylomorphism from dualism? Certainly, there are obvious dualistic aspects of Hurtado's theory. He takes matter to be naturally associated with extension, although he does not, unlike Arriaga, suggest to identify them. And he conceives of spirit as strictly non-extended, a rare point of agreement with the Thomists against the moderns, including Arriaga. Also, his understanding of matter and form as incomplete substances is highly reified, at least from the Thomistic point of view. Note that the talk about incomplete substances is not confined to the anti-Thomist faction. Even the Thomists thus label the soul and the body. But in Thomism, this is, as it were, an anomaly closely connected to the unique position of human soul in the system, and possibly a source of incoherence in the whole theory. In the non-Thomist conceptual frame, on the contrary, incomplete substances are part of the standard equipment, not a bug but a feature. To be a composite substance just means to be composed of a number of simple and incomplete substances. Hurtado is not being original here at all. His basic account is not different from that of his Jesuit predecessors and colleagues, Suarez or Conembersenses, and that of Arriaga later. And it goes back at least to Duns Scotus, whose interpretation of hylomorphism even ascribes substantiality to integral parts of a substance, like, for example, the individual organs of which it's composed. That a substance may be part of another substance is not viewed as a problem at all outside Thomism. And so it would seem that if Hurtado is an implicit dualist because of his reason, then almost any scholastic thinker except the Thomist is. And as another indication of looming dualism, okay, 2 minutes? Yeah. As another indication of looming dualism in Hurtado might be taken his doctrine of the union between matter and form. It might be argued that as soon as one abandons the true immediacy of hylomorphic composition in the Aristotelian terms of potency and act, one turns hylomorphism into his caricature. But again, would not such a charge affect the majority of scholastic hylomorphists? Clearly, the fact that Thomism hardly ever counted as the majority, let alone standard interpretation of the Aristotelian legacy, does not of itself imply that it is not the only philosophically consistent interpretation. It might be that the Thomistic tale is correct, and then the non-Thomistic aberrations were always pregnant with philosophical disaster. However, and this will be my final point, we cannot find out whether this is so without finding out whether Thomism itself is true. That means we cannot answer certain questions pertaining to the history of ideas, like does the logic of Hurtado and Arriaga's thought inevitably lead to Cartesian dualism, without answering certain genuinely philosophical questions, like are the Thomists right? To put it very simply, there is no perfect historical knowledge of a system of philosophy without the knowledge of its truth or falsity. There is no good history of philosophy without philosophy proper. Thank you.